If you open Article 185 of the Japanese Penal Code, you'll find a very clear law. All forms of gambling for money are strictly illegal. And yet, right in the heart of Tokyo or Osaka, multi-story buildings covered in blinding neon lights operate from morning until night. Inside, hundreds of people sit shoulder to shoulder, eyes glued to flashing screens, their hands controlling thousands of tiny steel balls. This is Pachinko, a commercial industry that once generated more annual revenue than all the casinos in Las Vegas combined. How can a game so heavily rooted in chance operate openly, generating tens of billions of dollars in a country that strictly bans gambling? Many people believe that owning a pachinko parlor is like owning an automatic gold mine. Just install the machines, collect the cash, and watch players lose. But the accounting books tell a very different story. Today, most pachinko parlors struggle with net profit margins of just a few percent, while equipment reinvestment costs and soaring electricity bills can easily wipe out profits entirely. What business are pachinko owners actually in? And how has this machine managed to operate legally for decades? To understand the financial mechanics behind these steel balls, we need to start with the first financial hurdle: the cost of opening a parlor. The pachinko market in Japan today is divided into two main categories: mega chains like Maruhan or Dynam, which operate hundreds of massive modern parlors in high-traffic urban centers or along major highways, and independent local parlors, typically located in older residential neighborhoods or near smaller train stations, housing around 200 to 400 machines. Regardless of the scale, launching a pachinko parlor requires an immense amount of upfront capital. First, there's location and real estate. Pachinko is a business entirely dependent on foot traffic. A standard parlor needs a massive footprint right outside a major subway station or on a busy highway with ample parking. Renting or acquiring land in these prime locations is extraordinarily expensive. On top of that, renovations must strictly comply with heavy soundproofing standards, high-capacity ventilation systems, and reinforced flooring capable of supporting dozens of heavy machines. Second, and by far the most daunting expense, is the machines themselves. A medium-sized parlor houses about 500 machines. A single brand-new pachinko machine costs anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000. That means buying the initial fleet alone requires $1.5 million to $2.5 million. But the problem doesn't end there. A pachinko machine is not a fixed asset you use for 10 years. Due to fierce competition and rapidly changing player preferences, the commercial lifespan of a new machine model is often just a few months to a year. Players get bored quickly if a parlor fails to update its lineup with the latest anime tie-ins or popular culture themes. Furthermore, regulatory bodies frequently update technical standards to curb gambling features. Every time new regulations are introduced, parlors are legally forced to scrap old machines and replace them. This constant machine replacement transforms what should be a one-time capital expenditure into a massive, recurring operational expense that relentlessly drains annual cash flow. Third is energy and security. Operating hundreds of machines continuously alongside massive LED screens, audio systems, and heavy air conditioning consumes a colossal amount of electricity. Combined with sophisticated CCTV systems and anti-cheat hardware designed to prevent electromagnetic or chip tampering, operational overhead escalates rapidly. So, with such high operating and depreciation costs, how does a pachinko parlor actually recoup its investment if gambling is illegal? To understand how a pachinko parlor generates revenue, we first need to decode the legal loophole that allows this industry to exist legally in Japan. This framework is known as the three-shop system, or Santen Kukan Hoshiki. This system operates fully in the open through three legally distinct entities. First, the Pachinko Parlor. Customers come in and exchange cash to rent steel balls, usually priced at about 4 yen per ball. They use these balls to play the machines. If they win, the machine dispenses more balls. But the parlor never pays out cash directly to the player. Instead, players exchange their winning balls for special prizes, or keihin, often small plastic tokens containing a microscopic piece of real gold or silver. Second, the independent prize buyer. Customers take these special prizes, walk out of the Pachinko Parlor, and visit a small, independent redemption booth located just around the corner. Here, this separate booth buys back the special prizes from the customer for cash. Legally, this is simply a private transaction involving the sale of personal property. Third, the wholesale distributor. A third-party wholesale company buys these special prizes back from the redemption booth and sells them right back to the Pachinko Parlor, completing the cycle so the parlor can hand them out to new players. Thanks to this detached three-party loop, the Pachinko Parlor does not violate gambling laws. The parlor merely sells entertainment and offers prizes, while the cash conversion takes place entirely outside its premises, with an independent second party. So where does the parlor actually make its profit in this loop? The parlor's margin comes from the house edge. When a customer spends 100 yen buying balls, the machine is not set to return 100 yen worth of winning balls. The average return to player, or RTP, for pachinko machines typically ranges between 85% and 90%. This means that across total ball sales, the parlor retains roughly 10% to 15% as gross margin. Historically, parlors employed nail adjusters called kugi-shi to manually bend the brass pins on the board, altering the probability of balls falling into winning pockets. Today, this is handled through audited microchips and digital settings. However, the parlor is not the only player profiting from this value chain. The entity holding the real financial leverage in the pachinko industry is actually the machine manufacturers. Companies like Sankyo, Sammy, or Universal Entertainment. These manufacturers continuously design fresh machines with captivating graphics, stimulating audio, and licensed intellectual property from famous anime. They sell these units to parlors at steep prices, forcing operators into a constant rat race of equipment upgrades just to keep customers coming through the door. As a result, a pachinko parlor is essentially a middleman, collecting small amounts of cash from a high volume of players, keeping a thin margin, and transferring a massive portion of that revenue right back to equipment manufacturers and landlords. But what keeps millions of players sitting in front of these machines day after day? If you've ever walked into a pachinko parlor, you know the atmosphere is overwhelming. Blasting music, the deafening roar of cascading metal balls exceeding 90 decibels, and an endless array of flashing LED lights. From a behavioral science perspective, this environment is deliberately crafted to induce sensory overload. When the human brain is bombarded simultaneously by loud noise and intense lights, its capacity for logical thinking and financial calculation drops significantly. Players easily slip into a hypnotic state, often called the pachinko trance, where they lose all sense of time and the real value of money. 3 primary psychological mechanisms keep players hooked. First is the near-miss effect. On the digital screen at the center of the machine, symbols spin rapidly. When 2 symbols match and the third stops just 1 slot away, the player's brain releases dopamine nearly identical to a real win. Pachinko machines are programmed to trigger these near misses frequently, tricking the brain into believing a big payout is just around the corner. Second is losses disguised as wins. A player might feed 5,000 yen into a machine and lose it all. But when the machine suddenly triggers a small payout worth 1,000 yen, accompanied by celebratory fanfares and flashing lights. The brain registers a victory, even though the player is net down 4,000 yen. Third is the social element and urban isolation. In modern Japan, intense work stress and societal isolation lead many to seek a way to unwind without engaging in complex social interaction. A pachinko parlor provides the perfect setting. You sit in a crowd, yet nobody speaks to anyone, and all attention is absorbed by individual screens. This combination of behavioral psychology and payout mechanics helped pachinko maintain steady cash flows for decades. But as the macroeconomic environment shifted, structural vulnerabilities began to emerge. During its golden age in the mid-1990s, Japan was home to over 18,000 active pachinko parlors. Today, that number has plummeted to fewer than $7,000, meaning more than half of all venues have shut their doors. This decline was no accident. It is the direct result of three simultaneous structural pressures. First, regulatory pressure. To curb gambling addiction, the National Police Agency, the governing body overseeing pachinko, has repeatedly revised the entertainment business law. New regulations strictly cap maximum machine payouts, drastically reducing the thrill and financial appeal for hardcore players. Furthermore, the introduction of smart pachinko and smart slot standards, which replace physical steel balls with digital data, has forced parlors to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars upgrading their tracking and data systems. Second, demographic shifts. The core customer base for pachinko has historically been Japan's aging population. Younger generations born into the internet era have access to countless cheap entertainment alternatives on their smartphones, most notably mobile gacha games. They simply aren't interested in sitting for hours in noisy, crowded parlors. Third, escalating fixed costs. During recent global energy surges, the electricity required to power pachinko parlors skyrocketed. For small, independent parlors, falling revenues combined with rigid rent and energy bills, plus the debt burden of replacing machines under new regulations, triggered a wave of bankruptcies. The lesson from the collapse of thousands of independent parlors is structural. A business model relying on legal loopholes and high foot traffic becomes exceptionally fragile when state regulations tighten and consumer habits evolve. So, when reduced to pure financial numbers, what does the economics of a pachinko parlor actually look like? Let's look at a simplified financial breakdown for a mid-sized pachinko parlor running roughly 500 machines. On the gross revenue side, total cash spent by players renting balls or tokens represents 100% of gross intake. Payouts to players at an 85% to 90% RTP consume 85% to 90% of total cash flow. The parlor's remaining gross revenue is just 10% to 15%. From this narrow 10% to 15% gross margin, the parlor must cover all operating expenses. Machines depreciation and constant inventory replacement consume roughly 30% to 40% of gross revenue. Rent and energy bills account for 25% to 30%. Staff wages, maintenance, and security take up 15% to 20%. Taxes and administrative costs absorb the remaining 10%. As a result, the final net profit margin for a pachinko parlor typically sits at just 1% to 4%. This means that to survive and generate meaningful profit, a pachinko parlor must operate on massive transaction volume. A slight drop in foot traffic or a sudden spike in electricity rates can instantly flip this razor-thin profit margin into a net loss. Owning a pachinko parlor, therefore, is not a story of easy money or effortless gambling wealth. It is a brutal operational management game, where owners must constantly balance expensive equipment costs from manufacturers, tightening legal regulations, and a steadily shrinking customer base. The next time you pass a glowing pachinko parlor in Japan and hear the roar of thousands of steel balls, remember that behind the spectacle is a financial machine running at full speed, struggling to retain a paper-thin margin in a shrinking market. Because in real-world economics, the businesses that look like easy money are often the ones paying the highest price just to stay alive.